Can you hear me? Firstly, thank you for inviting a lawyer into your presence. It must be a rarity for you to be spoken to by a lawyer, and thank you for inviting me. I've been a lawyer for 35 years in England, and for the last 20 of those, I specialized in crime, not what I would call naughty crime, but crime involving health and safety. And I've been involved in a number of high-profile cases involving corporate manslaughter. And therefore, I have some experience of the tensions which were experienced recently in your country during the trial following the L'Aquila tragedy. I want to start with a number of quotations which I think are relevant to you. And I want to begin firstly with one from Professor Rossi, who said in his abstract this: "The transfer of scientific assessment to the authority responsible for making decisions always presents sensitive issues, especially linked to the uncertainties that accompany the assessments. The events surrounding the L'Aquila earthquake have dramatically highlighted this aspect and raise profound questions about the sharing of responsibilities and further burden an already difficult task." He referred to the bridge between science and decision makers, the bridge between science and operation. And by use of the word bridge, I was reminded of the Simon and Garfunkel album, A Bridge Over Troubled Waters. And we are all well aware that there are troubled waters. I want now to adopt a Chinese expression: may you live in interesting times. We live in interesting times, but if we listen to Bob Dylan, you remember he said, "For the times they are a-changing." We live in interesting times, but we live in changing times. And we must also be guided by Clint Eastwood, who you remember in Dirty Harry said this: "Do you feel lucky, punk? Well, do you?" This is a challenge. Are we going to rely on luck going forwards? After the L'Aquila tragedy, 31 individuals and entities issued statements. They were passionate. They felt that things were going wrong. And if I could just read one of those statements to you, these are not my words, these are the words of IAVC, which were issued on the 28th of October in 2012. "Scientists involved in natural hazard assessment must clarify with their employer or the organization they are accountable or report to just what is expected of them, what their level of responsibility is, and what the chain of command and reporting protocols are between them as scientists and the civil and government authorities they work for. Without establishing such an agreed understanding, such scientists are vulnerable. And quite frankly, in the modern world of litigation, that's the litigation I know, they would be foolish." This is my contribution to start a process by which we no longer rely on luck and we will avoid being foolish. I hope that I won't come across as an arrogant lawyer telling you what to do. I'm pointing out the problem, and it is for you to work out the solution. I want to start firstly with the concept of the black box. Latour refers to it in a paper in 1987. It's not a new concept. It's from IT, the development of IT. And if I could just read out what is understood to be the normal definition of a black box: a device, system, or object in respect of which we know the inputs and the outputs, but we don't know or do not need to know the internal process or workings. Can I also remind you of another important concept, and to differentiate between societal risks and institutional risks? Societal risks are the risks faced by the public that we are all trying to protect. Institutional risks are those faced by the people who are protecting others. You'll see that institutional risks are now on our radar. I should also point out that in respect of institutional risks, I am the person within my firm responsible for protecting my firm from institutional risks. And in a firm of some 700 lawyers in 6 jurisdictions, I have a staff of 8 merely to protect my back. This isn't to protect my clients, it's to protect my institution. So we're going to look over the next 15 minutes at the black box of hazard assessment. Now, I appreciate not all of you are involved in hazard assessment, so you may want to, in your mind, open the black box of risk assessment or risk management. The lessons are the same for all of us. And what we have is an input, a black box, and an output. And you'll see that in this cartoon, we have a lot of mathematical formulas, and in the middle it says, then a miracle occurs. And on a daily basis, that's the process that you're involved in, that miracle. But in future, people are going to ask us, well, tell us how you do this miracle. And you see it says here, I think we should be more explicit here in step 2, where it says, then a miracle occurs. So we're going to now open up the black box and see what's inside. Now, what I'm going to portray is an extreme, and a rude extreme. And for many of you, this will represent something which you left years ago. I'm going to go from that extreme, which for some of you will be painful and I know you will find rude, to another position which may be a vision of the future. So we're going to unpack the current black box. Now, as far as hazards are concerned, in the old model, a hazard is an absolute objective truth, with little or no subjective content. The old model is that the fingerprints of scientists are not left on the nature which they discover, and it is capable of characterization. Of course, there are uncertainties, epistemic, aleatory, but there is usually limited acknowledgement of the limitations of science. The traditional role of the expert, particularly the hazard assessor, was the detached observer. And his impact, or the output end of the black box, was good hazard characterization. A characterization which is then handed on to risk managers. Here's our output, over to you. And these are the traditional values which experts have pursued. And of course, they are ideals and they're honorable. To be independent, to be purely scientific, for it to be appropriate, precise as possible, adequate, socially and politically neutral. A very important issue. unbiased, objective, accurate, truthful, correct, trusted, above all trusted and respected. Those are the output values. But I suspect that the traditional appearance of experts can be summarized by these words. And I hasten to add that in England, many, many jokes are made about lawyers. I don't know whether that is the same in Italy. Lawyers are usually portrayed as being superior, powerful, controlling, arrogant, contemptuous, distant, secretive, uncaring, and optimistic about their values. And most certainly the legal profession that I entered 35 years ago, a lot of the lawyers were like that. And it may be that you can remember certain members of your community who were like that, maybe like that still. I'm painting, hopefully, an old model. And a process which was top-down, distant and separate from risk assessment. So we do hazard characterization here, risk assessments down there, and it is sequential. But it is unaccountable. We're looking at processes which are often not recorded, they're not transparent, they're not open, accessible, they're far from democratic, and they're not audited. The scrutiny that this old system had was very little, occasionally by peer review, occasionally by the public in times of disaster, or by an intrusive media. With very little legal or regulatory authority scrutiny. L'Aquila brought that happy state to an end. That was appalling real-time scrutiny. And as far as self-governance of this risk governance process, there would appear to me, as an outsider, to be no self-regulation. There are no agreed professional standards. You can see that that's very different from perhaps the medical profession, the legal profession, and more recently, the banking profession. And at the moment, it is good to say that societal risks, looking after the public, is rather more important than looking after ourselves. And I've seen to date very little blame-related behaviours. In other words, behaviours merely to protect me rather than protecting you, the public. Traditionally, the role of risk managers and others was to appoint good scientists, good hazard assessors, and then listen to their output. Don't challenge it, just act upon it. The traditional model was to treat the public, and again, I say this of lawyers, when I entered the profession, I suspect that my view of some of my lay clients was that they were inferior, in a scientific context, unscientific, inappropriate, unsophisticated, cynical. I was right, they were wrong. And the model of communication was powerful truth, telling, educating the weak and ignorant. If I educate them, they'll start agreeing with me, not a question of my listening and then being educated by them. And the social science, perhaps still, is seen as an end-of-the-pipe bolt-on to assist me to educate them so that they will then agree with me. That is the ugly old model. But now, Bob Dylan is saying the times they are changing, and these are the drivers of change. There is greater opportunity for scrutiny. In most countries now, around the world there are freedom of information laws. It is thought by many, I think correctly, that democracy is pointless unless people have information. If they have information, they're more inclined to vote at the voting box and to be involved in the decisions in which affect them. There are national governance laws relating to natural hazards, and I don't have to tell you in Italy that they are very penal and demanding. Can I also introduce you to international human rights law? And you may be thinking, well, does human rights law apply to natural hazards like a volcano? Well, the answer is yes. And for those who are interested, the case law involves mudslides, believe it or not, in Russia. And there have been a series of cases, some involving Turkey, which say that a state, well, people have a right to life, and that can be preserved by a state protecting them from natural hazards. So regardless of national law now, we have overarching international law which says that states must protect their communities as best they can from natural hazards, would include volcanoes, and that after the event, in the event of a tragedy, there must be some official procedure whereby roles and responsibilities are analysed. So even if in your country, in Europe, this will come to other parts of the world, doesn't have demanding national law, there is overarching international law. So a greater opportunity for scrutiny, and with it a greater desire for scrutiny. Every day we see greater desire for transparency, openness, participation, and for people at all levels of life to have to be accountable, because the public want it, the media want it, and our regulators want it. But at the same time, there are higher expectations of governance. The public say, well, science is getting better. They should be able to make them better risk decisions. And better risk decisions means that I should be safer. And a corollary of that is that you will be better and I can do less. It's a learned helplessness. And I suspect there is a less respect for hierarchy or hierarchical authority. I'm not certain that I'm as respectful to my parents as my parents were to their parents, and my three daughters behave to me not in a way in which I would to my parents. And that is perhaps throughout society in general. And there is more regulation of regulators, and therefore there is a possibility, if we're not careful, that institutional risks will become far more important to us than looking after the public. So let's have a quick look at when we open the black box at some time in the future. For some of you, you've already unpacked your black box of the future or are on the way to designing it. For others, this may be an ideal many years away. So in other words, a change from an absolute truth to a more collaborative, co-produced hazard with more input from great shareholders. So the public risk assessors involved in the characterization of the hazard, rather than scientists saying, this is a hazard, over to you. And that will be a very big culture change. Of course, we will always have uncertainties. But we have got to be better at communicating them. Communicating the uncertainty to a law court is perhaps one of the greatest challenges, because lawyers, and particularly judges, haven't got a clue about the concept of probabilities, because most probably they gave up maths at the age of 13. But we will have to do that better in the future, and we will have to be far more honest about the limitations of our science. We've got to be more ready to say, despite advances in science, we don't know. And we've got to have the courage on occasions to say that. And also, I think we've got to also have the courage to say that even if we put further time and effort into whatever it is, we will still have a vast degree of uncertainty. The role of the expert will change from that of the detached observer to the participant observer or activist. Hazard assessors will get more involved in risk assessment. Risk assessors will get more involved in hazard characterization. The fingerprints of both and the public will be on the model. It won't be this sequential model which we favour at the moment. And all of us will have to maintain these very important values when there is greater pressure to be involved in risk management. And as we know, risk management involves economics and the pressures of politics. And it will be important for us to maintain the purity of science, to be trusted and worthy of being trusted, worthy of trust. And those may be useful benchmarks against which we will wish to be judged in the future. We will want to change from this old model and to be seen as independent, candid, realistic experts within a wider team, multidisciplinary team of experts and the public. So a far greater integrated role for the social sciences rather than science, risk, perhaps a bit of social science, public. A much more integrated mix in the future. We talked of a top-down system. We're going to see in the future a more integrated process. And it is a process which will have to be recorded. Why? Because you will want the evidence of good practice when things go wrong. It will need, your process in future will be transparent, it will be open, it will be readily accessible. It will have to be more democratic. It will be audited. Most areas of life now are very highly audited. It will be scrutinized. And hopefully it will be improving as well. My view is that one should always welcome scrutiny and use it constructively to say, we could have done it better. Let's learn the lessons and improve for the future. At the moment, we have a model with no self-regulation. I suspect that we will have a model of self-regulation going forward. And at our workshop in Arice over the last few days, we've already started the process of having some benchmarks against which we can judge whether we're up to the pace of other parts of the world or behind them. Sharing standards, learning from others and moving on. That's the model of the future, I suspect. And this is my greatest concern, is that in time, and this is the model from my industry, the law industry, medicine particularly, that we will institutional risks, the fear of criticism, the fear of litigation will change our behaviours, so that we get bound by the protocolization of process, so that process matters far more than that which comes out of this better black box in the future. And in the role of risk managers will change as well. Whereas we will be involved more in risk assessment, they will want to become much more involved in hazard characterization so that they can get the very best out of the science, that the science is more focused to the decisions, very difficult decisions, which they have to make. So rather than it will be more bottom-up, more outcome-focused. What's a win look like? We're all dealing with ultimate improved safety. We start there and then work back up the manufacturing process at each stage, not taking our eye off the goal. And in future, it won't be a powerful truth educating, inverted commas, inferior others. It will be far more the joint production and framing of knowledge, listening to our consumers, getting their involvement in ensuring the whole thing is far more collaborative. So this is my summary, and this is not a lawyer telling you what to do. These are prompts which I hope that will resonate with you, is that the future roles and responsibilities of hazard assessors and risk assessors need to be discussed openly in each jurisdiction. Hazard assessment processes should be outcome, impact focused. They should be driven by that outcome, and only once we know what outcome is needed, we then go back and say, well, what is the resulting role for hazard assessors? And it should be clearly defined. So should those of risk managers. So in footballing terms, we all know where we're going to be standing on the park, and that we don't all clamber into the goal and leave the other parts of the pitch vacant, which sometimes happens. We will need published dynamic, I mean ever evolving standards and checklists, which hopefully will lift standards and assist, and these will be necessary going forward, consistency, transparency, and accountability. And now we come to the biggest challenge, will be to achieve greater collaboration and better knowledge production and exchange within those assessment processes whilst maintaining your standards of being trusted, trustworthy, scientific excellence, and independence. Because if we move into a mixed hazard and risk assessment process, which I suspect is the way forward, the influence of politics and economics and all those societal influences may lead to growing impurity of science excellence. If I could just remind you that it was Hesiod, the Greek, his character, who was Prometheus. And Prometheus stole fire from Zeus. And Zeus, in response, sent down to Earth Pandora with a box. And Pandora was told, don't open the box. You remember the story? She opened the box, and out came the evils of the world. And you hopefully will also remember what was left in the box. And what was left in the box was hope. And it is my hope that when you open your current box and you open up your black box of the future, that you won't be relying on hope. And you won't be relying on the words of Clint Eastwood, being lucky, that you will have thought about what you want in your black box, what does society require from the output, and that it's a black box which, when subject to scrutiny, is one which is found to be good and not possible of criticism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of questions, and if you can stand until a few minutes until the coffee break. Are there questions or comments? I have a comment myself, if you allow me. You raised many, many interesting questions, and which are those that we are confronted every day. So I'm not so sure I share your views in everything. It seems to me that there is a concept which is not taken into account explicitly, that is that there must be a different degree of responsibility between those that are asked to decide what to do and those that give the scientific advice. In a way, for many points of view, the L'Aquila problem was precisely that there was a mix between responsibilities. And that, I think, we should avoid. So when you call for a more integrated system, it has to be well specified because, of course, top-down and far-looking advices, etc., these are bad aspects. But there must be a separation because otherwise the scientists will be involved into the decisions. And it seems to me that this is not really advisable because then a decision has to be taken on the basis of integrating much more things than simply the risk of hazard. It has to contain societal, practical, boundary condition, etc. In other words, coming to L'Aquila, one thing is to say there may be an earthquake tomorrow or whatever, what are the probabilities, etc. And the other question is, given all that, are we going to ask people to leave their houses? This is a question which is much more complex and cannot be given an answer simply from a scientific point of view, because you have to consider many more aspects. How many people will die if you just evacuate one town compared to how many people will die if you don't do that? This is something that is not a scientific question, and it has to be clearly identified where is the responsibility for doing that. And it seems to me that L'Aquila showed exactly the danger to mix the two positions, and the position that has been taken by the Department of Civil Protection is to, in fact, to separate the role of the scientific advice with the role of taking the decision on the field. I'd like to have your opinion on that.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I think there is you can have integration as long as people are very clear what their roles and responsibilities are. Maybe to go back to my footballing analogy, in future we will have many players on the pitch at the same time. Earth scientists, risk management decision makers, sociologists, members of the public will want to contribute. And therefore we will have an integrated system, but the roles and responsibilities of each person on that pitch must be very clear. I personally favor a model which does keep separate the scientific purity, and for that scientific input to be very carefully recorded so that it isn't changed by the pressures of economics or politics or the real practice of very difficult decision-making, particularly in an emergency. And therefore, that's a model that I would favor, so that we have a more integrated approach, but the actual scientific input to the process is very carefully documented, recorded, so that we can look back on that in post facto and everything is okay. So I don't think that you and I are disagreeing there.